Go. All right, so last week you had Tuesday to take the exam and I gave you a week to do it, so it's due by midnight tonight. If you took the exam, it probably gave you a grade the minute you hit the submit button and you freaked out because it said something like you had a 50%. That's because I have to grade the essay by hand. I can't, it doesn't automatically grade the essay. You know, artificial intelligence is great, and there are programs that will do that, that will grade essays. I still like to actually do my job and read essays, so I grade them. So don't freak out about the grade once you submit it. If you haven't submitted it yet, that'll pop up. But don't freak out. It will get better after I've graded the essay, unless of course you didn't do the essay, which sometimes students don't do the essay for some reason. They just figure that, you know, I don't know, D's get degrees is what works, I guess. So anyway, we're gonna talk about corporate culture, and next time we'll talk about corporate governance and how it impacts ethics. So we talked about J&J's Credo before, and I showed that to you, I believe, and we discussed it, and I talked about how I thought that, at least in the past, they were a good example of a highly ethical, why is this not pausing? This thing just like absolutely insane. So looks like it's paused now. They have, for the most part, throughout their corporate history, lived by that credo, and it's been a, you know, I think a huge benefit to them in terms of their overall success. So in marketing, we talk about a SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Culture and corporate governance are the S and the W, the strengths and weaknesses of the SWOT analysis. They are your internal aspects of the firm, as opposed to the opportunities and threats which exist outside the firm and impact the firm overall. There are companies that have great, in the past, corporate cultures and governance, and because of external threats, they didn't survive. So having a great culture and governance is not necessarily a guarantee of success, but I think it is one of the things that is important and an important aspect of success. So let's talk about culture. We can talk about culture as a macro level experience, or you know, a macro level sort of societal artifact. And what is it that makes us, for example, when we talk about culture, what is it that makes the United States, for example, different than other countries around the globe? Yes.
We're just a big melting pot, so we have a lot of different cultures and stuff.
Okay, so that analogy has been used a lot in the political science and sociological literature, the idea of the melting pot, the idea that we have a lot of, God, I hate this stupid, I hit pause and it doesn't go to pause. It won't pause the slideshow. Let's see if it'll pause there. No? We go. Hopefully it's going to pause there. Once you do one of these, I did this for online, the narrated PowerPoints for the online classes, so that they didn't have to watch the entire video if they didn't want to. And it just insists that it's going to play no matter what I do. I keep clicking the, like, there's a pause button here and it's just not working. Anyway, so this idea of the melting pot, that we have a lot of different cultures that have come here. We are, I guess, in some respects, what some authors have argued is that we are the only nation state ever to exist based on an idea and not sort of a geographic and hereditary artifact. That, the United States started out as, God, stop doing that. Let's see if we can do it on this one. Let's try that and see if that works. If I just do it on the screen instead of on the one with the notes. The United States started out with how many states originally? 13, right? How many stripes are on the American flag? 13 for the 13 original states, colonies that made up the United States. And they formed a nation based on an idea that we wanted representation of our ideas and values in the English Parliament if they were going to tax us. No taxation without representation. And this is sort of unique in the history of the world. Most states, nation states, developed around sort of ethnic, tribal identities that established themselves, and again, historians would be horrified by my oversimplification of this, in specific geographic areas. Now, the birth of the nation state, the modern nation state, is debatable as to when that exactly occurred. There are identities established, and it's oftentimes linguistic with various geographic regions. So, for example, the Italian peninsula, they spoke primarily Italian, although if you go into northern Italy, you'll find people that are Germanic speakers, Italian, and some French. But it's this identity that establishes around maybe a language, an ethnic group, and control of a geographic area. Now, how they got control of that geographic area will vary. But this group establishes themselves in a location. They have this language that develops, I guess, organically over time, and they then form the nation state. Now, the nation state is a function, and I asked you before, when does the modern era begin? And we had a lot of debate about when modernity began, and then we had a lot of debate about when post-modernity begins. But the nation state is largely a function of modernity and the development of very well-defined sort of physical geographic boundaries. Now, those have changed. If you went back and you looked at, for example, a map, I was a high school exchange student. I graduated from high school in 1992, which to most of you might as well have been World War II or even the Civil War, because that's about how much history most of my students seem to remember. I mean, you all don't even remember the first Gulf War, which was a huge deal when I was in high school when we invaded Iraq the first time. If you went back to that point in time, I was a foreign exchange student in high school to what was West Germany. So there were two Germanys, and I don't think any of you have ever lived long enough to have experienced two Germanys, but there were these two Germanys. After World War II, we divided the German state into two parts. One that was controlled by the Soviet bloc and Soviet influence, one that was controlled by the American bloc and the American influence. But even the German state, wasn't really fully formed in the, latter part of the 19th century until the early part of the 20th century. And there are parts, for example, Austria, which is a German-speaking area, and culturally German, they are a separate state. But you get the idea. The nation state has this idea of boundaries. It's largely defined by a linguistic ethnic group, and that comprises a political entity that develops based on these kinds of things. In Britain, for example, it's an island nation. Now there are different ethnic groups, but once it was established as sort of a nation state, you have these clearly defined, most of the people in Great Britain speak English, although there are other languages in that region. The Welsh, for example, in Wales have a language that's distinct. The Scots had a language that was distinct. So you have this English language, this political community, and it's largely defined over the course of centuries by dynastic rule. And that's how a lot of nations started out. We started out with this ideal that we want representation if we're going to be taxed. If you're going to impose laws on us, we want representation in the English Parliament. I'm not sure why the camera is not working. Let's see if I can get it to follow me. There's just all kinds of technology issues in this classroom today. Got issues with the PowerPoint, issues with the camera. There we go. It's coming back. I guess I've got to watch like 5 different things going on up here on the screen. During COVID, when we had a lot of students that were not in class, I was having to watch my phone because people were texting in to participate in the classroom discussion. So it was really crazy. But yeah, the technology is not always the greatest. So we have this idea of a nation state, and you talked about the melting pot. One of the things that's been criticized about the melting pot analogy is that, do we actually give up, as opposed to these other places where there is largely a well-defined cultural group that has political dominance in that area? Do we in America actually give up and melt into the society?
Not necessarily.
How so?
In some ways, I feel like there are things that have to melt together as far as law and things like that. But ethical values and personal values and beliefs, no. That's why the United States is the United States. You can believe what you want to believe.
Okay. So you don't think that the melting pot necessarily, and you're using ethics, what would be, for example, a difference in ethical values between some ethnic groups that you could think of?
So I'm a chef as well. I've met a lot of different ethnic backgrounds along the way. I've noticed that I've worked with a gentleman from Iraq. His values towards women were a little different than, say, somebody from Egypt.
Okay. All right. I think those are good examples. I would venture to guess there's more similarity between Iraq and Egypt than there is between American values towards females and those, although I don't know, maybe some people would debate that as a result of the fall of Roe versus Wade, right? But clearly we have, some idea of at least equality in a rough sense among the genders. Yeah.
Moving away from like the ethical side of things, I feel like the different culture groups, like they retain the culture from where they originated from.
Okay, so you think how can you give me an example of that?
Well, yeah, so did you say you were Czech?
A chef.
Oh,
Chef.
chef. Okay, well, I was thinking Czech. So like for example, Yukon has the biggest Czech fest in probably the entire United States. And so we celebrate things like that. And then we also celebrate, or like different cultures will come and still celebrate specific holidays that are relevant to their lineage or whatever. Not or whatever, but just as an example. So I feel like,
So we have a Czech festival and they
yeah,
have like things that are very indicative of Czechoslovakian food, I guess, that they have at the Czech festival, although all of these festivals seem to have corn dogs. I don't know what that's indicative of. But yeah, so this idea of the melting pot has been criticized, that we don't actually give up a lot of our own identities or culture when we come into the United States. We keep them, and maybe we pass some of those on, maybe we don't. I think that the melting pot is somewhat appropriate, although other people have said that we're more like a salad bowl. You put together a salad and every item in the salad has an impact on the taste and flavor, whether or not you put, bell peppers, which have, why are the bell peppers not hot as opposed to, say, I don't know, Hatch green chili peppers, yeah.
It's like a Chipotle burrito bowl.
Okay, yeah, like there's this different, the meat has a different flavor and texture from the beans or the rice and things like that. The salad, if you have iceberg lettuce, it's got a different sort of texture from romaine lettuce. If you combine lettuce, if you have onions in there, that's got a different, and you can still identify those parts. The melting bowl is that, the melting pot analogy is that what comes out is we're all just kind of a homogenized version of something that came before. And a lot of people say that's not really what happened, although to some extent it is. When cultures come here, they have a tendency to, maybe the generation that immigrates here doesn't speak English primarily because they didn't learn it in their home country, but the next generation certainly does. And generally by the third generation, I have friends, for example, who are Vietnamese, and they are now third generation, and their children, that third generation, the children don't know Vietnamese. Right? I mean, they're not speaking Vietnamese. Maybe that's a bad thing, but so I think you have a balance. It's not necessarily one or the other, but that is part of our cultures, that we have this mix of identities in the United States to a greater extent than you have in many other parts of the world. What are some other things that make us American, uniquely American?
We're very upfront. Like,
You think so, really?
I don't know. I feel like
So one of my colleagues, Dr. Zhao, he is from China, and he says that one of the things that people tell him when he goes back to China is, he says they'll just be like, "Oh my God, you've gotten fat." We have a tendency to not say things like that in the United States. Although I suppose we are more blunt than other countries. For example, England, you could literally, let's suppose this is the 1970s. That's when we had a lot of hijackings of airplanes because security was much more lax than it is today. I mean, they had security, but it wasn't the professionalized, standardized thing that we have. Each airport sort of had their own and determined how they were going to do it. I guess there was some kind of rules, but I remember when I first started flying, so I got my pilot's license when I was 17, which is the youngest that you can be to get your pilot's license. I soloed at 16, so you can get a student certificate at 16. You can't take passengers in a student certificate, so I was 17. My brother was considerably younger than I was, and one of the biggest thrills for him was I would fly him from the Guthrie Airport down to Will Rogers, and at that time they had something that was called the General Aviation Gate at the main terminal. at Will Rogers. So he could literally, I would say, when I called the tower, I would say, Will Rogers Tower, Skyline 713 Papa Mike, inbound, landing. This will be a full stop taxi to the terminal for passenger departure. And they would literally have somebody come out and just meet us at one of the sky bridges. They would, if I told them what flight he was on, I could taxi up close to that flight and they would have somebody escort him in and on to the aircraft without going through a mag. Do you know what a mag is?
Yes.
What is a mag?
Isn't it the tunnel that goes to the,
It's a magnetometer. It's what they used to use to detect whether or not you had a gun.
Mhm.
Now they have, far more sophisticated machine. You all have done this at the airport where you stand in it and it does a scan of you, right? So going back to, my example, 1970, you get on an airplane going to London and oops, it's hijacked, where you are taken to Syria and the hijackers keep you on the plane because they're demanding the release of certain individuals from, say, the British and the American government that they believe are political prisoners. And what happens on an airplane? Well, in Syria, it's hot. It's 100 degrees in the summer and the toilets are overflowing and all of a sudden you come down with dysentery because there's no clean water and there's just these health problems. And finally, you're rescued after 2 weeks of living in 100+ degree temperature with overflowing toilets on this airplane and taken to London Heathrow, which was your final destination. And you get off the plane and you meet, some British guy. You stumble to the first pub that you can find and order a beer. And you ask some British guy, how are you today? And he says, oh, I'm fine. How are you? And you proceed to tell him this tale of woe that you've undergone. You've been hijacked and held for 2 weeks in Syria on a plane with 100-degree heat. You had overflowing toilets and, the vast majority of the passengers got dysentery. The British guy's probably likely to look at you and say, oh, it sounds like you had a rather rough spot there, but how is the weather in Syria? Rather hot. It's awfully cloudy these days. I mean, the Brits are notorious for not expressing large amounts of emotion, much like their food. They're sort of bland. I mean, it's just not great. And they're going to be horrified that, as Americans, we have a tendency to share. Sharing is caring. We think everybody wants to know, and they don't. I mean, they're the Brits think that a wonderful conversation revolves around two things: your health and the weather. And with regard to your health, the only acceptable answer to how are you today is I'm very well, thank you. That's it. Anything else is way too much information for them. Whereas Americans, part of our culture is we have a tendency to just vomit all of this information on people. You ask how we're doing, we're likely to tell you, not realizing that it should be a rhetorical question. How do you do? Very well, thank you. How do you do? So that's part of the British culture. As a nation, do we have cultures even within the country?
We have all the Native American tribes.
Okay, so we have Native American tribes. Are there differences in cultures even among the Native Americans? So when we say Native American tribes, we have a lot of them here in Oklahoma. When we say that, are there differences even among the tribes?
of course.
Huge differences.
Yeah.
I mean, when we say Native American, it's not a monolith. It's not one thing. There were differences in tribes based on whether or not they were nomadic, for example, or whether or not they were agricultural. In my home state of New Mexico, the tribes that we have there tended to not be nomadic. And so they established communities that were pretty well defined. And as a result, their cultural homogeneity has remained very high to this day. They tend to be very sort of insular communities, even though we have all of this technology that has obviously impacted them. They still, in many respects, you'll find many of their tribal members still live in much more traditional ways than we do in Oklahoma. And for example, the Cherokees or Chickasaw Nation. Chickasaw Nation Industries, I think, is the wealthiest tribe in the United States. And it's not just casinos. And it is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry that extends well beyond the state of Oklahoma. They are one of the largest defense contractors in the United States. They provide, for example, computing services in terms of architectural, computer architectural and programming design, right? So my cousin, for example, was a contractor with CNI at Fort Huachuca. CNI held the contract for Fort Huachuca to develop. He's a computer architect. In the olden days, everybody was just sort of a programmer. We now have architects, so architects are responsible. As I understand it, I'm not a computer scientist like he is. Architects are responsible for sort of the overall overarching project, whereas a programmer may be just focused on one specific aspect of the project. And so they were designing a learning management system for the United States Army, and CNI held the contract for a long, long period of time. So they're an enormously wealthy and an enormously powerful group. So much so that they went toe to toe. They don't call their head of their, so in New Mexico, almost all of the tribes that I had experience with had a chief. I think maybe one tribe had a governor, but the Chickasaws call the head of their tribe Governor Anatoly. And he went toe to toe with Mary Fallin when she was governor of Oklahoma, and he won. I mean, Kevin Stitt has gone toe to toe with the Native American tribes, and largely they've won. So those tribes, because of the experience, first of all, they weren't native to Oklahoma. There were tribes that passed through here, but they were largely relocated here. And as a result of that experience, they're different than, for example, the tribes in New Mexico. Their culture is different. As I said, the tribes in New Mexico that I have had experience with in the past tended to be very homogenous. They were, they married within the tribe, they stayed within the tribe. In Oklahoma, a lot of the tribes, you wouldn't know that they were a tribal member unless they tell you that they are a tribal member, right? That they are card carrying. You're pointing to yourself. Which tribe?
I'm Chickasaw. I'm a quarter, and you can't tell if I have blonde hair, blue eyes.
I mean, so the Cherokees are, there are a lot of Cherokees that are very similar. My former law partner, who's now passed away, his nephew married a Cherokee, and she's blonde and blue eyed, and as far as I can tell, doesn't have an enormous amount to do with the tribe, unlike the tribes in New Mexico, where the members really do have a lot to do with the tribe, other than to take advantage of the benefits. That's not a statement of value, that's just sort of a statement of fact. She takes advantage of the benefits. One of the benefits, I will tell you, I just learned this the other day of being a tribal member, is that the tribes will not share their license plate registration with the state of Oklahoma because of the disputes that they have. And so if you go through the turnpike, it now does the bill pay. If you don't have a pike pass, they have no way of collecting on that bill pay. because the tribes won't share their, so I don't know how long that will last. But I found this out from a friend of mine who's in political science the other day. I was like, wow, that's, I wonder how many of their members know that and don't have pike passes, because, it's pretty interesting. So we have these other cultures, even within the United States. So we can look at culture as this macro level thing, and then we can go all the way down to micro. So corporations have these cultures. So cultures are symbols, words, ideas, values that we have as a group. Any group that comes into existence will have values, these beliefs, expectations, the meanings that that we associate with certain things. The core values that we tend to hold dear. One of the things I listened to was a podcast, a Freakonomics podcast on America's just different, so let's stop pretending that we aren't. And Stephen Dubner, who hosts the show, talks to all of these experts in the field of why is American culture so unique. We are different among the world in many aspects, some of them not very good. One of the things that we are very different in is that we are the only nation to not have some form of universal health care coverage. And we keep saying we don't want it. We don't want, what is the word that they use? They think this is a bad word, at least the Republican Party, socialized medicine. I get news for you people, we have socialized medicine. And Republicans will say, and this is not a statement of, this is a statement of fact. They will say things like, and I will criticize the Democrats as well, they will say things like, we want freedom of choice. You don't have freedom of choice in a non-socialized, the only non-socialized system is the United States. You don't have freedom of choice because most of you have to go to the doctors that are approved by your health care plan. If you have socialized medicine, everyone is in the national network. You can go see any doctor. That's just a statement of fact. We're the only ones. Yes, in theory, because we have a totally sort of capitalistic or less socialistic system, we have some amount of socialism. It's called Medicare and Medicaid in the United States. You have someone, if you can pay for it, if you can afford it, yes. The vast majority of people can't afford to pay for their health care. My mother's 73 years old. She got dehydrated. She went to the hospital. You know what one night in the hospital cost for dehydration, what the bill was? If she didn't have insurance? $15,000. For IV fluids and labs. Anybody have that kind of, yes, if you're Donald Trump, I guess you have the money to pay, although that's debatable. You have the money to pay for that. Most people have to go to the doctors, they have to go to the hospitals, they have to go to the providers that are in their network, that are selected by their insurance companies, right? So we just don't have, we have some socialized medicine in the United States. Everybody else, every other nation has socialized medicine. One of the advantages to being late to this party is that we could do the Blue Book exercise here. We could look at other countries and say, we don't want that, or we do want that. I'm gonna joke here, I don't really mean this, but when I was a kid growing up, this is less so among your generation, but everybody hated the French. In fact, there was a movement in Congress and they did this in the House. In the House, when Newt Gingrich took over the House in 1994, I believe, they renamed French fries Freedom Fries because they didn't want to have any association with the French. So we can all, hate the French, joke. But one of the things that the French do is they probably do healthcare pretty well. I mean, one of the things that they pointed to in terms of when they were railing against socialized medicine was the British system, where there are long waits for non-emergency type procedures. The French have a combination. Everybody has basic health care coverage. And if you want premium coverage, you can pay for that through private insurance or through private pay, as I understand their system. Now, it may have changed since the last time I looked at this, but we could sort of say, yeah, we like that idea. We want basically Medicare for everybody so that people are not dying in the streets outside of hospitals because they can't afford to pay for it. And by the way, the people that are dying in the streets outside of hospitals are not the poor, because the poor get Medicaid. The people that don't go to hospitals and that die as a result are largely middle-class entrepreneurs who cannot afford the healthcare premiums on their own. It's not the poor in this country. It's people who own their own businesses who can't afford $1,000 a month healthcare premium. So that's an example of our values different from the rest of the world. But even within the United States, when we think about these things, are there differences in values and culture from geographic region to geographic region? So unlike the United Kingdom, I talked about Great Britain and their non-willingness to sort of listen to our, wanting to tell our entire life history to them. Because again, what are the two things the British think are acceptable topics of conversation with somebody that you don't know, that you're not intimate with? Your health and the weather. They're like obsessed with the weather in Great Britain, and they should be. I mean, even more so than we're obsessed with the weather in Oklahoma. And we're pretty obsessed with the weather because it changes frequently in Oklahoma. I went to Chico, California last week for a USCA, University Sales Center Alliance meeting. And when I left, it was approaching 100 degrees. And when I came back, they had actually had snow in parts of Colorado, I think, and it was freezing in Denver. And it was just it was one of the 5 days in Oklahoma that it's just sort of comfortable when I got off the plane here. And the wind wasn't blowing 90 miles an hour or some other, tragedy that befalls. But your health and the weather, we like those. Are there differences even within the United States in terms of culture?
There's differences in like East Coast, West Coast.
Okay, so that's a big one, is East Coast versus West Coast. Although, is there that much difference between the East Coast and the West Coast?
It's it.
If-
East Coast and South.
North and south.
If you look at politics, both California and New York voted for who against Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, right? Both of those, I mean, and there was no way Donald Trump was ever he was from New York, he was not gonna win New York or California or Washington or Oregon. I mean, we think that there's like this East Coast, West Coast difference, and there is in terms of like clothing, certainly. Like you look at New York kids, they all wear black. I mean, everything is black. Black. They're obsessed with black. There's no color. Whereas California has lots of, vibrant colors. You said North versus South. I think there's a big
Yes.
difference there. Southern food is just different than
So good.
Northern food. When my brother lived in upstate New York, we would go, he's a breakfast person. I'm not a breakfast person. I don't like to eat breakfast. If I do eat breakfast, the problem with it is that I'm starving the whole day. Like they always say, breakfast is the most important meal. If I eat breakfast, I'm gonna eat 5,000 calories in a day because I just am starving the whole day. If I can wait until about 11 or noon, I might eat once or twice. But if I start with breakfast, it's gonna be a constant battle all day. But my brother loves breakfast. He always wants to go to breakfast. So we'd go to New York and he wants, and it's, well, I'm on vacation, so I'm gonna go to breakfast. And everywhere we went, I'm like, do you have biscuits and gravy? Like if I'm gonna have breakfast, if I'm gonna burn the calories, if I'm gonna expend the calories, I want something good. I want sausage and bacon and eggs and biscuits gravy. They had no idea what that was in any place in New York. They had no idea what biscuits and gravy were.
Southern food.
I finally found the racetrack there was serving at the morning workouts. They were serving, so you can go watch the horses do the morning workout before track season. They were serving biscuits. I was so excited. I was like, "Wow, we gotta go to the track, gotta go to breakfast." And it was a pretty good breakfast. They had bacon and sausage and eggs. And then they had biscuits and gravy, and I got the gravy and I was so excited. And I bit into it and I'm like, what is this? And the waiter comes by and he's like, "Oh, it's turkey gravy."
Oh my God.
And I'm like, "Are you kidding me with this? Turkey gravy for breakfast? It's supposed to be sausage gravy for breakfast." There's a big difference and Southerners know
No.
their gravy.
I love that we're known for that.
What, known for?
That we know our different gravies.
We
yeah.
do, well, like
It's true.
there's cream gravy, there's black pepper gravy, there's mushroom gravy, there's just general brown gravy,
Chocolate gravy.
chocolate gravy. Yeah, they had that at the fair one year. That's not, but there's lots of gravies. And, we're sort of, we, and everything on a stick. That's the other thing that Southern fair food will teach you. You can put mashed potatoes on a stick. I didn't know that. You can put mashed potatoes on a stick, corn dogs. You can put cheesecake and deep fat fry it and put it on a stick. Really good, right? We deep fat fry everything. They don't have a tendency to deep fat fry everything in the eastern
No.
part of the country. So those are some cultural differences that we have, even within the same sort of geographic region.
Mhm.
There are differences. We are more culturally like Texas than probably other states, but there are still differences. Texans think that they live by that model. It's a whole other country. And everything's bigger in Texas. And they believe that. They're very proud. Oklahomans are like Texans with some amount of modesty. And maybe worse roads. Texas seems to build Cadillac highways compared to Oklahoma. Well, why is all of this important to businesses? Well, in Built to Last, Successful Habits of Visionary Companies, a research book on this topic, they found that companies that have these strong corporate cultures, these strong cultural values in the company, on the whole, by and large, over the long term, did better than companies that didn't have these values. Now, the thing about culture that makes it interesting from an ethics perspective is that, and when we talked about the challenges to philosophical ethics, we talked about this idea of cultural relativism and the problems with cultural relativism. The idea, and as Americans, because and this is where I do think the melting pot analogy is somewhat appropriate, as opposed to the salad bowl. If we were just a salad bowl and every single thing retained its individual characteristics, we wouldn't have much agreement and we wouldn't have much acceptance or tolerance of other cultures. But as a result of the fact that when you do have some melding of cultures and they do have impact on each other and there is some blending, as a child, I was one of those kids. How many of you were kids that, since I'm a chef and I cook, I could not have any of my food touch. There's a reason that kids are like this. How many of you were like this? You could not, in an extreme form, there's a autism spectrum disorder called sensory processing disorder, which it plays an impact here. So people who have sensory processing disorder have extreme reactions to stimuli. And one of those, for me, I have a mild case of sensory processing disorder, is that I get physically ill, for example, with regard to certain things. And it's sort of hard as someone who likes to cook and who's someone who earns part of their living from cooking, in that like I have tried to eat fish and shellfish, and it just like I throw up. Like the texture, the smell, I mean, I can like, I've never found a fish. I can eat tuna fish, like tuna fish salad sandwich sometimes. I can, if there's enough mayonnaise to cover up any smell. And tuna fish doesn't have the texture issues that I have with things like shrimp, which have this kind of gritty, funny, rubbery texture that I don't know. So, kids are funny because they haven't destroyed their taste buds with smoking and drinking and just age. They don't want anything to touch in their plate. That's why they make children's plates with like, dividers so that nothing touches. When you get older, you start mixing everything together because it's harder to get flavor out of things. And so you want the flavor and it's hard to get. And so you start mixing, like I would not eat mashed potatoes and gravy. I didn't like gravy as a kid. I like just mashed potatoes, no gravy, because it's just kind of disgusting. Now it's like, oh God, I want mashed potatoes and biscuits and gravy and, all of those things. So you don't want anything to touch, but as you get older, you do, and you start mixing this stuff. And so it is, even in a salad, if you put enough dressing on it, it can start to become difficult to tell where one piece is different than another, right? And I think this is one of the things where the melting pot analogy does work around the edges, in that we do have this respect. And one of these ideas that we have as a result of this, that is an American value that is different from many other places in the world, is that we did from a very early on stage, not perfectly, I'm not claiming that, but we did start saying we needed to respect other cultures, at least in business. Once we get to the postmodern world of marketing and business, much earlier adopters of that notion that we need to respect other cultures and be respectful of them. And so there is this tolerance for other cultures that I think is somewhat unique to America and American business. For example, and it's codified in our laws. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and a lot of other countries don't have this problem, where we say you can't engage in you can't engage in bribery of foreign officials in order to get a business advantage, where that's just expected in many parts of the world to this day. If you want to do business, you're paying off somebody. And we have a law that says don't do that. Don't do that, right? So, but there's this tolerance. We're taught that we should have a lot of tolerance for other cultures, and that is good. One of the things that it can lead to is when we have extreme forms of cultural relativism, you get this thing with regard to cultures that develop where you say, well, that's just the culture of that company. That's just the culture of that group, and we should accept it. And I'm not sure we should. And what they found in Built to Last was that these companies that were successful did have core sets of values, but they weren't always good values. They weren't, from an ethical standpoint, what we would consider to be highly ethical values. One of the companies that they detailed was Philip Morris. Philip Morris manufactures cigarettes. That's their biggest product. And at the time, and I think they diversified somewhat, but at the time that they wrote the book, they said the executives at Philip Morris were described as being ruthless and cunning and insisting that there was nothing wrong with selling a product that people did not need. There was absolutely nothing wrong. If you've watched a movie, it's a spoof, but it's based on some amount of truth called Thank You for Smoking. And what they detail in that movie is the smoking tobacco companies' attitudes towards the healthcare concerns that people were raising regarding smoking. And the other one was the gun lobby. So they have these gun lobbies that have huge outsized influence in the United States political culture. And in Thank You for Smoking, you know, they had labs of doctors who were committed to proving that smoking did not have an impact on your health. We know, I mean, in science, we never say things are facts with regard to research. We say the research suggests, and people pick up on that and they act like it, but it's as close to fact as we get in science to say things like smoking is bad for your health. Now, are there people, you know, so what they'll do is they'll look at these things and they'll find anecdotal samples. And they'll say, well, here's a guy who's 105 in Ukraine that smoked 3 packs a day all of his life since the time he was 8 years old. And he's okay, there's a lot of variance in human genetics. But by and large, on the whole, what we know is that most people, if you smoke, you have bad side effects from it. I went to law school, almost everybody who went to law school when I started smoking. If you didn't smoke before you went to, you smoked after your first semester. And I can tell you, as somebody who smoked for a long time, you know, I mean, and I was a runner because I wanted to drink beer. It had bad effects, and I quit when I couldn't run as much as I could in the past. And I will tell you, even without, let's suppose that I never developed any kind of cancer or anything like that from that experience. One of the things that I did notice, there were 2 times in my life when I have noticed a dramatic increase in both my ability to taste things and in my ability to smell things. And the first was when I quit smoking. 6 months after I quit smoking, and I haven't smoked, it's been 20 years now, since I got out of law school. I had like this, like 6 months after, I hadn't been to Outback in probably 6 months. And I was like, I'm not sure I like this. Like, it is really spicy. But smoking dulls your sense of taste and it dulls your sense of smell. And it was incredible. The second was I quit drinking any kind of carbonated beverage, any kind of soda pop, things like that. And it has increased my ability to both smell and taste dramatically. So I mean, even without any other side effects, that's one that that you will, and everybody who's stopped smoking notices that they have an increase in their smell and their taste. One of the things that I have noticed, for example, in my course of teaching over many, many years, is that people used to come in with wearing a lot of cologne or perfume. Almost nobody wears cologne or perfume anymore, and you know why? We have fewer smokers. And you can almost always tell a smoker, like somebody who walks by with a lot of perfume on or cologne, it's like, probably a smoker. And people used to you'd walk into a bar and the Tommy just hung heavy in the air. The Drakkar or whatever it was that was the most popular thing. So you don't have to have you don't have to have a good culture. Are these cultures, so is this something that is organic, that comes from the bottom up when we talk about these things? Did Philip Morris start out with this sort of evil culture? I mean, if we went back in time to the early time of, tobacco manufacturing and processing, it's a product of the New World. So tobacco was not known in Europe until modernity, when they came over and they discovered it and sent it back. But people didn't understand the health implications that we understand today with regard to tobacco. Did Philip Morris start out as this sort of ethically problematic company? Or is it something that was imposed on it from the top? Is culture something that sort of bubbles up organically? Or is it imposed on the employees or your citizens, if we're talking about a nation state, from above? What do you think?
I think the general idea is imposed, but the actual values bubble up from the lower employees up.
Okay.
But the top employee tells them what he wants them to do, but it doesn't mean the employees will always have those values.
Okay.
I somewhat agree with that. I feel like it comes from the top down. Cause a lot of times now it's if you don't like it, you can go.
Yeah, that is true. You don't, I mean, it's my way or the highway.
Right.
I'm paying the bills. Love it or leave it. I think it could be both, right?
Yeah.
It depends on the age of the organization, the size of the organization, and the effectiveness of its leadership. Let's take UCO as an example of this in terms of management and business. How long has UCO existed? Well, we're the oldest institution of higher education in the state. We were the first state college in the state. We started as the teachers' college, right? That's what we started at. It was the territorial, actually, we started before, I think, statehood. We were the territorial normal school. Normal schools were what they called teachers' institutions that existed to train teachers. That was our primary focus and primary mission for so many years. Now, the reason that you have this expansion on a teacher's college and you then have, so we started out as a college and then we became a university, generally speaking, again, oversimplification, because this is not a perfect match. We use these terms kind of loosely. But generally speaking, universities are collections of colleges. So we have the College of Business in the university. Now, again, not perfect because there are, like Skidmore College in New York, where my brother lived in upstate New York, is a college, but they have, a school of business, they have a school of fine arts, they have a school of liberal arts, things like that. So we start out as the territorial normal school. Well, you start out by doing teacher training. And how do you train teachers? Well, you sort of teach them what people did in the past. It was about classroom management, things like that. But they also have to have what? In addition to sort of classroom management practices and how to convey knowledge and things like that, they also have to know what? Well,
What they're-
something to what? Go ahead.
They're teaching?
Yeah, you have to have some idea of what you're gonna teach, right? So you have both this idea of how to do this, which is largely what they focus on in colleges of education, but you also have to have something to teach, which has been one of my big arguments against colleges of education, is that when my mother went through and became a teacher, you got a degree and then you did an extra year basically at the school that she went to. It was a 5-year degree program. You got a substantive degree. Her degree was in English. And then you did a year in a college of education where they taught you how to, make bulletin boards or whatever, how to make transparencies or dittos at the time. You all have never experienced a ditto machine. These were great. Before copiers, we had these things called dittos. They smelled good. Like, again, somebody who has sensory processing disorder. It's got a sweet smell to it. So you'd write on this special form, and then your teacher would have you, if you were like the teacher's aide or, whatever, the teacher's pet, they would have you go make dittos. And you'd put this form on a drum, and then you had this ditto paper, and you would copy. And the first few copies were pretty good. The problem with ditto machines was that as the template got more and more used for making more and more copies, it started to blur and it became fuzzy, which is why copy machines sort of took over. But ditto machines were really cheap. And you actually, the first ones that when I was in grade school, actually they weren't like an electric thing. They were like a hand cranked, this drum with this over this paper that would make dittos. Then they became electric. So you learn, how to do that. In the olden days, they would teach them about what things you put on the board, how you use the chalkboard to, illustrate points. Now we all use PowerPoint. Right? I mean, every once in a while, I throw the screen up and I start writing on the board because I have something that I forgot to put on the PowerPoint or whatever. But those are the things. So they now have classes in education called Emerging Technologies in Education. and things like that. It's not just about, you know, how to use a board and how to make dittos and things like that. It's learning how to do that and then the tools and techniques for conveying knowledge, but you have to have some knowledge to convey. Well, where is that knowledge that you're going to convey going to come from? Well, it's going to come from substantive disciplines like marketing, management, political science, accounting, economics, finance, biology, chemistry, those kinds of substantive deals, right? So you have this organization that starts out as, we're going to train teachers, but we have to teach them something. So, you know, initially it was, well, they got to be kind of have a smattering of things. So you have a course called government, which we now call political science. Although Harvard, by the way, still calls it the Department of Government. They don't call it the Department of Political Science. So you have a course in government, which teaches you things about, like, you know, for the most part, what teachers are going to be interested in is sort of basics of American government. We have 3 distinct branches of government. They don't have this in other countries necessarily. We have a legislative branch which makes laws. We have an executive branch which enforces laws, and we have a judicial branch that interprets the laws. 3 distinct, like they don't have this. In Great Britain, for a long period of time, the House of Lords functioned as the Supreme Court, and it was the upper chamber of Parliament. They now have a Supreme Court. They've sort of modified it. But the Prime Minister is a member of the House of Commons. The Chief Executive Officer of Great Britain is a member of the House of Commons, which is kind of like our House of Representatives. There's no distinction between those branches. That's called comparative politics. But, you know, a teacher's college focuses mostly on, like, well, we got to teach students about, you know, we have 3 forms of government. The executive branch is headed by a president. We have a judicial branch, which is headed by a Supreme Court. We have a legislative branch, which is composed of 2 chambers. The House of Representatives, which is headed by a speaker, which is in chaos right now, and the Senate, which is headed by the Vice President of the United States, who acts as President of the Senate. Right? Those are things that you need to know in order to teach. Now, how you do that, you know, in olden days, when I first started teaching, I was a political scientist, and we would put this, I would draw this diagram on the board about how a bill becomes a law. You have the House, and you have intro, right? And most bills can originate in either house, right? So there's an introduction, and then it's assigned to committees, right? So I'd write this on the board. You've probably heard of something old-fashioned now called Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law. You might have seen it on a YouTube video. I don't think they play it on actual television anymore, but you might have seen it. And then you go through the thing, and then it goes to the president ultimately. If a similar bill comes out of conference committee and is signed by both houses, it goes to the president for signature. So I do this kind of thing on the board, right? So that's what they would teach you in teachers' colleges, and then you'd have some classes that would teach you about substance. Out of that, of course, at UCO, we then start saying, well, you know, we've got people who don't necessarily want to be teachers, they want to be political scientists, and they want to study this stuff. And so we have colleges that, from this one college, we were the Territorial Normal School, and then we became the Oklahoma Normal College, I think is what our name was next. And then we were, Central State Normal, I think, College or something like that. I'm probably getting our history wrong, but, we end up as the University of Central Oklahoma, all these iterations later. What that means is that we're really, really old. We have a long history. There's been a lot of, the first president may have had a lot of impact initially on establishing a culture here, but now we have presidents that come and they say things like, I'm going to shake things up like the last president did. And the faculty revolted. And she's gone. Praise God and Greyhound. Right? We have a tendency to just keep on. When I was an administrator here, we hired a guy. I was hired under George Nye, and we hired a guy whose name was Cornelius Wooten, and he came into our office and he told my boss and I, he's like, you two don't know what you're doing, you'll be gone. I'm gonna get rid of you. And I just said, with all due respect, sir, I was here long before you came and I will be here long after you leave. And as a member of the Office of Legal Counsel, the day we got to tell him he was leaving was one of the happiest days of my life. I used to fire people, that's what I did here at UCO. I was remarkably successful at firing people. I was very good at it. I could never fire a faculty member. Why? Tenure. That impacts the culture. So a president can come in, the president technically does not, the president of this institution technically does not hire or fire me. I am hired by the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges, who now insist that they're Rousseau, even though the Constitution of the state of Oklahoma says that the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges. What does that mean? I tell I'm the department chair for marketing. I tell my faculty all the time, I'm not your boss. I'm the first among equals. And I am, because I'm not. I can't tell them what to teach. I can tell them when to teach. I can tell them what classes they're going to teach, but I can't go into their classroom. That's called a violation of academic freedom, and tell them, you're doing this wrong. Don't write it on the board. Do PowerPoints instead. That's the new, and I think PowerPoints are awful. But I've finally given in to the PowerPoint thing. That's culture, right? And that's an organic part of culture. Initially, the president probably had a lot of power to say things like, you know, we're going to have this thing and we're going to establish tenure and it's going to mean something. But once it's established, do you have a lot of power? Kind of depends on the organization, the age of the organization, the size of the UCO is a big organization. When Dwight David Eisenhower was elected president, he followed Harry S. Truman. Truman was famous for having a sign on his desk that said, the buck stops here. And Truman said, poor Ike, he'll be the most frustrated man in America, because Dwight David Eisenhower had been Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. And he said, he'll go do this and do that, and nothing will happen. Because as a general in the United States Army, if you turn to someone he was a 5-star general. If you turn to somebody who's a 4-star general, you look at the epaulets on their shoulders and you say jump, that person says how high. In civilian government, if the dean comes down here and says jump, I can say, see ya. Good luck. You know, I had a professor who stabbed a student with a pencil, and I could not fire him. Tenure. So you can see how these things play a role. We'll continue with this next time, and we'll talk about corporate governance. And I will try and get the essays graded. I can't promise it'll be this week because I've got a lot of stuff going on, but I will get them to them just as quickly as I can. But don't freak out by that first score. You all did get a score when you submitted it, right? If you got ducks, come and see. Let me turn the recording off.
I looked it over for you too. Thank you.